Today's show is sponsored by Adventures Unlimited Press. Take your mind on a literary journey and go to adventuresunlimitedpress.com to purchase books from our famed experts right here on Truth Be Told. That's adventuresunlimitedpress.com.
What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Hello and welcome back to another amazing hour of Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and with me now, the one and only Eddie Connor.
Thanks, Tony. I got a question for you.
What's that?
Do you believe in Santa Claus?
Oh, Eddie, you know I believe in Santa Claus. And just in case he's listening, I've been a very good boy this year.
I laugh at you. Well, this hour is going to be a lot of fun and educational, too, because we have best-selling author William J. Federer joining us. William is a nationally known speaker and best-selling author, as well as the president of AmeriSearch.
I personally love American heritage, and I'm very psyched to touch on a few of his books.
I am, too. And his book, There Really Is a Santa Claus, The History of St. Nicholas and Christmas Holiday Traditions is something we're going to speak about today.
And I think very much in the news right now, we want to talk about the book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, History of Islam and the United States. Very important about the political season right now.
I think so, too. We might even touch on his other best-selling book, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, which guess how much they sold?
How many?
500,000 copies.
Jealous.
Very impressive. So let's welcome best-selling author William J. Federer.
Hey, Bill, how you doing?
Well, Tony and Eddie, great to be with you.
This is going to be a great show, and I'm ready to learn something. I'll tell you right now.
There's lots of people waiting for us to learn something, Bill.
I know, being a C average student. So, Bill, I'm excited about you being on the show, and I'm a big history buff myself. So I want to start by finding out, when did you become such a student of history?
Well, my dad was an attorney, historian. He was the head of several historical societies in the St. Louis area. The Crondelet Historical Society, which was a little French community prior to St. Louis being founded, and then a Chatillon de Menil mansion where it's all the fur trappers and Lewis and Clark.
Right.
And so I grew up with a love for history, and I guess I got a degree in accounting. I sort of minored in history, and then I gravitated in that direction, and it ended up turning into a career.
Well, you know, I'm from Kansas, so we're neighbors. Well, a little bit far from each other, but growing up in the Midwest, you know, we do get to sit down and listen to our grandfathers and fathers to tell the stories. And what was one of the first subjects or a historical figure that you kind of fixated on and wrote about?
Well, I did a book on George Washington Carver. He was an African-American scientist, and my mom grew up in Neosho, Missouri.
Oh,
and
wow.
That is near where George Washington Carver was from, Diamond Grove, Missouri. And so we would go by his birthplace. And then later I decided I was going to read through all of his personal correspondence. And I actually put together a book, and it's called George Washington Carver, His Life and Fate in His Own Words. So it's excerpts from his personal letters talking about what motivated him.
And what was the number one thing or one of the biggest things that stood out the most to you about him when you were doing the research for his book?
Well, his references to faith. I thought this is a fascinating aspect of him. And he said human need is really a great spiritual vacuum that God seeks to fill. With one hand in the hand of a fellow man in need, and the other in the hand of Christ, he could get across the vacuum, and I became an agent. Thus, the passage, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, came to have real meaning. And he went on to say, as I worked on projects which fulfilled a real human need, forces were working through me that amazed me. I would go to sleep at night with an insoluble problem. When I awoke, the answer was there. And by saying, why then should we who believe in Christ be so surprised at what God can do with a willing man in a laboratory? But just fascinating stuff like that. I did a book on FDR, read through all of his personal correspondence, and he was in office for 12 years.
Right.
Did a book on the history of income tax, sort of into my degree in that.
Oh, wow. That's an evergreen subject. And you could, well, first of all, I know you had to have made that entertaining, didn't you?
Right. Well, there was no income tax until the Civil War, and the federal government was supported by tariffs on things like, taxes products being brought into America.
Right.
The problem was the South had to pay the tariffs, which made the foreign goods more expensive to create a market for the northern factories. And so at one point, the South was paying 90% of the federal budget.
What?
That's one of the reasons they got upset at having to pay these tariffs, and they wanted to, eventually try to change that, and it turned into a civil war. But anyways, Woodrow Wilson had pushed through the first income tax in 1913. So prior to 1913, you didn't have to worry about that. But I go through that history, and then I did several books on the Revolution. I did one with my wife called Miracles in American History. So there are times in our country's past where there's a crisis and it looks hopeless. French and Indian War, Revolution, War of 1812, and we had people of faith and courage, and things turned around. People forget, when we had the Revolution, we were breaking away from the most powerful king that planet Earth had ever seen.
Yeah.
And the British Empire included all of India, which is a quarter of the world's population right there, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, and the Americas. And here we're going to break away from this king, and we have no army and no navy. And so it's, anyway. But I did do a book on St. Nicholas, so it's called There Really Is a Santa Claus, the history of St. Nicholas and Christmas holiday traditions.
And that's, a week away is Christmas Eve, if you're listening to the podcast, so we are excited to have you here to talk about that because, as kids, we've always heard of Santa Claus, and we watched the cartoon movies and the claymation of, but we really don't know a lot about the history of St. Nick. And if you could tell us, what was your interest of doing the research on St. Nicholas?
Well, St. Nicholas is the most popular Greek Orthodox saint. So St. Nicholas is to the Greek Orthodox what St. Peter is to the Roman Catholics. And so he lived during Roman times. There were 10 major persecutions of Christians in the first 3 centuries. And he lived during the worst, a guy named Diocletian, who had lost some battles with Persia, and he asked his generals why. And the general said that he had neglected the Roman gods. And so Diocletian orders the military to worship the gods, and then uses his military to force the whole Roman Empire to return to worshiping the Roman gods, and starts this 30-year persecution. And so Nicholas is born during this time in Patara, Asia Minor. Today that's Turkey. And the story is that his parents were wealthy and elderly and died when a plague swept through town, leaving him with a lot of money. And he wanted to help the poor, but he wanted to do it anonymously. He didn't want to get the credit for it, wanted the credit to go to God. And so the story is a merchant in the town of Patara had gone bankrupt. And back then, the creditors would come and not only take your house and lands, they would take your children.
Oh, my God.
So the sex trafficking and slavery. And so this merchant had 3 beautiful daughters. He knew if they were taken, it would probably mean a life of prostitution. So he had an idea. He thought if he could hurry up and marry his daughters off, the creditors could not take them. Unfortunately, he did not have money for a dowry, which was needed in that area of the world for a legally recognized wedding. Well, Nicholas heard the problem late one night, came down, threw a bag of money in the window. Supposedly it landed in a shoe or a stocking that was drying by the fireplace. Provided the dowry. The oldest daughter was able to get married. It was a big buzz, talk of the town. Did it for the second daughter. When he threw the money in the window for the third daughter, the dad ran outside and caught him. And Nicholas made him promise not to tell where the money came from. Again, he wanted that credit to go to God. This was the origin of the tradition of secret gift giving and midnight visits by Santa and the stockings by the fireplace. And he died in 343 A.D. on December 6th. And the Greeks have lots of stories about his life, and some are more believable than others. But he was going to join them. He gave away all his money, and he was going to join a monastery. And somehow the Lord told him not to hide his light under a bushel, so he went back to Asia Minor and got off the boat in a city called Myra. Myra, Myra. And unbeknownst to him, the bishop had died. And the church leaders could not decide who the next bishop's going to be. And so one of them has a dream. The first person to church the next morning would be named Nicholas, and he was to be their bishop. When sure enough, he walks in, they ask him his name. Well, he was not too thrilled about the idea because the Roman Emperor Diocletian was collecting bishops and killing them. So it was sort of like, you be the bishop. No, I insist. You be the bishop. And so sure enough, he was arrested and he put in prison and awaiting death. But then there is a change. The emperor is struck with an intestinal disease so painful that he abdicates the throne on May 1st, 305 A.D. And it's sort of a little bit humorous because the emperors had been declaring themselves God, sprinkling gold dust in their hair and demanding that their image be worshipped. And so when the emperor stepped down, it was sort of like a God resigning, I guess. And well, the next emperor, Galerius, continued the persecution. Finally, there's a Constantine, and he ends up becoming the next emperor. And the story is that he was fighting the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside of Rome against another general named Maxentius. And Constantine claimed to have seen the sign of Christ in the sky. And he puts this on all of the shields and symbols. You say, well, what was the sign of Christ? It was the first two Greek letters for the Greek name Christ. And so the first letter was the X, which made the K sound. And then the second letter is called the Rho, and it makes the R sound, and it's written as a X and a P. And so he puts this on the shields. You may have seen some, 4th century Roman art. It has a big X and a P, sort of religious, but it's Roman. Well, over the centuries, it got shortened to the X, and it was called the Chi, and it was called the Christ's cross, or as we say today, the crisscross. And they would use it as a form of a written oath. So you'd sign a document, and you swear you're going to keep this document. You would sign it at the Christ's cross. Today, that's come down to us as sign at the X. And then you would kiss it to show sincerity. So that's come down to us as the X's and the O's on the bottom of a Valentine. You pledge your faithfulness and then kiss it to show sincerity. And then it's also where we get the word Xmas, the X-MAS. You think, they're crossing out Christ. No, that's the Greek letter that stood for Christ, the Chi. And also the cross, my heart, swear to tell the truth. Well, the cross was the Chi, it was the Christ. But anyway, so Constantine puts this on the shields and symbols. He wins, and then he stops the persecution. And this is when Nicholas is let out of jail. And Nicholas now goes down to Myra, the port city, and preaches against paganism. Nearby was a temple to Diana, and it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It had 127 huge pillars and temple prostitutes. It was the Las Vegas of the Mediterranean, and he preaches against it. The people tear it down. And then there is the Arian heresy. A guy named Arius had started this heresy. He said Jesus was a little less than God and a created being, and made a catchy song. And the Visigoths, who were a tribe that was invading Rome, converted to Arianism. And Constantine, the emperor's, his attitude was, look, Christians, I legalized you, and now you're fighting. And because I sort of made Christianity the religion of the empire, and now you're fighting, it's splitting my empire. So all you bishops get to Nicaea and settle this thing. Well, they do in 325 A.D., and it's called the Council of Nicaea, and they write the Nicene Creed. And the tradition is that Nicholas went there, and he was so upset at Arius for starting this first of all heresies that Nicholas slaps him across the face at the floor of the conference. So jolly old St. Nick had a little temper. You better watch out if he's coming to town. And so I forgot to mention that because he threw those 3 bags of gold in the window, he became the patron saint of pawnbrokers. The pawnbrokers will hang 3 gold balls in front of their shops. You ever see those little symbols of 3 gold balls? That's reminiscent of the 3 bags of gold Nicholas threw in the window. Well, the Greeks have a story that there was a storm, and the sailors could not get back to the dock, and they get Nicholas to go down, and he prays, and the sea becomes calm. And so he's considered the patron saint of sailors. And there was another story of a corrupt governor who was going to execute a couple soldiers to cover up his corruption. They rush and get Nicholas. He goes down and breaks through the crowd, grabs the sword out of the executioner's hand, and then turns to the governor and reads his mail in front of everybody. Sort of like the Holy Spirit told them what the governor had done. And so the governor begs for him to pray for him. And anyway, he dies on December 6, 343 A.D., and the Greeks would leave presents for each other. And then we have Vladimir the Great, the Emperor of Russia, converts to Greek Orthodox Christianity in 988 A.D., and he adopts Nicholas as the patron saint of Russia. That's why so many people in Russia are named Nicholas or Nikolai. It's a little bit of a humorous story. Vladimir threw all the pagan gods in the Dnieper River, and when word got out he was going to embrace monotheism, some Muslim ambassadors show up. And it's the first chronicle of Russia, their first court record says that Vladimir listened intently when the Muslims told him that he can have lots of wives and that paradise was filled full of women. And he says, because he was fond of women. But then when the Muslims told him that he could no longer drink alcohol, Vladimir said, we cannot have this because drink is the joy of the Russes, the Russians. So I think it's sort of interesting that Russia didn't convert to Islam because Vladimir liked to drink. But then the Greek Orthodox show up, and they spoke Greek, the language of the New Testament, and they had the largest church in Christendom for 1,000 years. It was called Hagia Sophia or St. Sophia's. And so he converts. But then something happens. The Muslims invade, and they would tear down the churches and destroy the graves of the Christian saints. And so Muhammad said, leave no high grave standing nor a work of art without obliterating it. So the Muslims destroyed the pyramids. They actually had a sultan who had a whole commission to find out where the pyramid treasures were and raid them and trash them. And so like they blew up the Buddha statue in the mountains of, there in Afghanistan.
Right.
And so the Christians did not want the bones of their famous Greek saint Nicholas trash. And so they moved his remains over to Italy in the year 1087. And they had a church called Cattedrale Niccolò de Bari, Cathedral of Nicholas of Bari. And the church was dedicated by Pope Urban II. Now, you may not be up on your pope names, but this is the same Urban II that went to the Council of Clermont and begged the Europeans to send help because all these Greeks are getting killed. They send help. It's called the First Crusade. So the same pope that dedicates the Church of St. Nicholas there in Bari, Italy, is the same pope that calls for the First Crusade. Anyway, the Muslims had 14 centuries of crusades, and the Europeans only had 2 centuries of crusades. And, maybe 1 million died in the European crusades, but they estimate 240 million died in the Muslim crusades. Anyway,
wow.
So his graves are now in Europe, and the traditions of St. Nicholas spread, and these Italians liked the gift giving, and it becomes so popular that in 1223 AD, St. Francis of Assisi, sort of in protest, comes up with the nativity scene, the creche scene, the Jesus, Mary, Joseph, donkeys in the manger,
right.
and wanting to say, well, the reason we're celebrating is that, Jesus was born in the manger. Excuse me. And then we have the Reformation in 1517, and Martin Luther starts it. And by this time, there is a saint's day for every day of the year. And Martin Luther considers this a distraction from Christ, and so he outlaws all the saints' days. But the Germans like the St. Nicholas gift-giving stuff, so Martin Luther moves all the gift-giving to December 25th and says all gifts come from the Christ child.
Ooh.
The German pronunciation of Christ child is Christkindl, like kindergarten, kindercare, and Chris means Christ, Kindle means child. And over the centuries, Christkindl ended up getting pronounced Kris Kringle.
That is
so Kris
fascinating.
Kringle is really Christkindl, which means Christ child. And then it gets even more interesting in England. Do I have a few more minutes?
Yes.
Oh, of course. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm following this pretty good here. This is great.
So Henry VIII brings the Reformation to England, but not because of any spiritual experience. He just wants another wife. And the Pope wouldn't recognize his divorce, so he makes himself his own Pope. He goes on to have 6 wives. But anyway, he ends the saints' days, including the popular St. Nicholas Day, but he brings back an old Roman holiday because Britain used to be a Roman colony.
Mm-hmm.
The holiday is called Saturnalia, and Saturn is the god of feasting and many merriment and partying. And if you've ever seen The Christmas Carol with Charles Dickens, there's the spirit of Christmas present.
Right. Uh-huh.
And there's this big guy with wreaths in his hair and goblet of wine and grapes all around, sort of a ho-ho happy party guy. And you're asking yourself, who is this guy? He sort of looks like Santa, but he sort of looks like some Roman god. Well, that was Saturn, but they Christianized him and called him Father Christmas. Wow. They could not call him St. Nicholas because St. Nicholas was sort of outlawed. Anyway, during this time, Christmas in England became a partying, carousing, drinking, wassailing, where they would take a drink of booze and throw the rest of it on a plant so they would have a nice harvest the next year, and Yule logs, and so it sort of became like a Mardi Gras. Now, Mardi Gras used to be a religious day. When they would fast 40 days before Easter and Lent, but now it's this little party in New Orleans. Well, that's what happened during the time of Henry VIII. And so there was this movement called the Puritans. They were wanting to purify the Church of England, and they were really strict, and they actually had a civil war, and they won in 1640. And what did they do? They outlawed Christmas. They said, can God be honored by mad mirth and hard drinking, fit for a Bacchus or a Muhammad in Ramadan? Certainly the Son of God cannot be honored by this. Anyway, so when the Puritans settled Massachusetts, they had a 5-shilling fine for anybody caught celebrating Christmas.
Really?
And so there's really none in the colonial New England, but the Dutch settled New Amsterdam, which became New York, and the Dutch loved St. Nicholas. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Now, you know how Catholics say St. Peter's at the gates of heaven?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the Greeks do a take on the account where Jesus will return at the end of the world riding a white horse, judging the living and the dead. The saints will come back with him riding a white horse. St. Nicholas is one of the saints, so certainly he'll be one of those guys riding a white horse. He just gets to come back once a year for a little mini judgment, a little checkup, right? And in Norway, they don't have horses, so he's riding a reindeer. And the saints come from where? The celestial city, the New Jerusalem, the heaven. Well, that turns into the North Pole. And the angels turn into the elves, and the Lamb's Book of Life and Book of Works turns into the Book of the Naughty and the Nice. And so you see these biblical themes that sort of drift away. Well, the Dutch, even to this day, have St. Nicholas. They pronounced St. Nicholas Sinterklaas or Sant Niklaas. So like Santa Monica, Santa Fe means Sant means holy, and so Nicholas. So Sant Niklaas is where we get the Santa Claus. So in Holland, they have Santa Claus coming once a year, dressed as a bishop, because he was a bishop, right? And he's got his mitered hat and his staff and his robes, and he's riding a white horse. And he gives presents to the good kids. But he has with him a little Moorish costumed helper, Zwarte Piet. Now, who were the Moors? They were the Muslims who controlled Spain for 700 years, and they enslaved over 1 million Europeans.
Wow.
And there were whole Catholic orders in Europe during the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians. The head of the order was called the ransomer, and they would collect alms and donations to try to ransom back your friend out of Muslim slavery. Well, they would tell the little children in Holland that if you're good, St. Nicholas will give you presents. If you're naughty, his little Muslim helper will put you in a gunny sack, take you back to Spain, and sell you into Muslim slavery.
Oh my God!
And so often when you would tell a little kid that Santa's coming, he'd start crying.
He's like,
He thought about his
I'm
last
good.
night with his family. And I actually did a call-in radio show, and a guy calls in and goes, "Yeah, I was raised over there in Europe." And every Christmas Eve, all the little boys would make sure to have pocket knives in their pockets when they went to sleep on Christmas Eve. I said, "Why is that?" He goes, "That's to cut ourselves out of the gunny sack in case we woke up at Zwarte Piet sack, you know."
That's hilarious.
I just think it's funny. I'm one of 11. I have 11 brothers and sisters, and we used to sort of, tease and torment my little brothers. And I wish we would have had that story to tease them with. Couldn't go to sleep. Santa might come, and of course, we may never see you again. Anyway, well, now the Dutch settled New Amsterdam, and remember I said how St. Nicholas was the patron saint of pawnbrokers, but he was also the patron saint of sailors. Yeah. So the Dutch, instead of putting on the front of their ships a mermaid or a Poseidon, they put a St. Nicholas carved in the front of their ship.
Wow.
And so their boat became one of the largest Dutch churches is the St. Nicholas Dutch Reformed Church. And so when they settled New Amsterdam, they had a big Dutch Reformed St. Nicholas Church. And it actually was the largest Protestant church in Manhattan. And it was at 48th and 5th Street Avenue. And but then the city turned financial, and the church membership dropped, and they sold the property to some oil company. But nevertheless, it was there. So in New York, there is a couple writers. One is Washington Irving. Now, we know him because he wrote Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle.
Right.
Well, Washington Irving wrote Dietrich Knickerbocker's History of New York from its founding to the end of the Dutch dynasty. Now, Dietrich Knickerbocker was a made-up name. It was sort of like, Paul Bunyan's Blue Ox.
Right.
It was this little fanciful stories. But it was such a popular book that it got associated with New York, and that's how we have the New York Knicks basketball team.
Oh, wow.
And in the book, there's a city in Holland called Gotham, and in this book, he starts using this name, and that's where New York got the name Gotham City. But it's all this Washington Irving. Well, in his book, he says St. Nicholas visits us once a year, riding in his wagon over the treetops, throwing out presents to his favorites, dropping them down the chimneys, and he puts a finger by his nose and giving a significant look up the chimney he rose. And but Washington Irving describes St. Nicholas as wearing not a bishop's outfit, but a Dutch outfit of long trunk hose and boots and leather belt and a stocking hat. But he's still called St. Nicholas. Well, then in New York, the British take it from the Dutch, and so now it's gone from New Amsterdam to New York in 1664. And so in New York, you have a writer named Clement Moore. He's a Hebrew professor and Anglican. He writes a poem for his children, A Visit from St. Nicholas. So the night before Christmas, and all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care in hopes that St. Nicholas would soon be there. But now he's shrunk in size. He's a right jolly, plump old elf. I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself, a broad little face and a round little belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. The stuff of a pipe heel tightened his teeth, and the smoke had encircled his head like a wreath. It's like, when did he take up tobacco? Where did that come from? Because tobacco came from the American Indians, right? Virginia, tobacco shipped back to Europe. Anyway, and then we have the Civil War. And there's Thomas Nast, was an illustrator for Harper's Weekly magazine. He's the one that gave us the Republican elephant and the Democrat mule. And he did put it in his political cartoons, and it stuck. Well, he's the first one to do an illustration of St. Nicholas speaking to the Union troops with a North Pole sign behind him. Prior to then, St. Nicholas came from heaven, the celestial city. Now it's the North Pole, and it was actually a political jab at the South during the Civil War to say St. Nicholas is associated with the North. Right? He's a political cartoonist. Mm-hmm. And then in the late 1800s, St. Nicholas starts growing again. And then there is Haddon Sundblom. He was the artist that gave us the Quaker Oats Man on the Quaker Oats box.
Oh, yeah.
Well, he does a painting for Coca-Cola for once a year for 30 years of St. Nicholas, Santa Claus drinking Coca-Cola. And now he's full-grown, rosy cheeks, ruddy complexion, a nice huggable grandfather, full of sack of presents. Everybody loves him. And that's the image that spread because of TV and mass marketing. But it all started with a real guy who lived from 280 to 343 AD. He loved Jesus so much he was, became a minister, a bishop, and was imprisoned for his faith, and he preached against, all the immorality, and he slapped Arius for starting the Arian heresy. But we remember him because he was generous and he helped out a family in their time of need. But he didn't want to get the credit for it, so he did it anonymously. And just a fun, fascinating story that sort of weaves together a whole lot of Western civilization history.
Wow.
We just learned more in this
now.
25 minutes with you than I have learned all of the years I was in school and the 54 years I've been on this planet. Should I be embarrassed?
That's amazing.
Hey, I appreciate you having me on.
No, that honestly was amazing, and I know you have to go, and we're gonna have to have you back because there's so much more we want to talk about with you. You're I don't know if you have grandchildren or children, but they must be very fortunate to have someone to be able to tell them the stories like you have, the knowledge you have.
And we know you have a son because you're taking him out to dinner after
you
talk
true,
to us.
True.
Right.
Well, how can people find you, follow you? I know you do radio and some other things. So how people can listen to you and find out more information about you?
Oh, thanks so much. My website is AmericanMinute.com, AmericanMinute.com. And I send out a free daily email of something that happened on each date in history. And so if you like these stories, you'd probably like that.
Oh, yeah, and that's what I was listening to earlier in yesterday, some of your daily stuff. So it's great.
And just in case somebody's tuning in right this minute and they're not getting to hear this yet, we know that they can go back and download it and watch it on YouTube and iHeartRadio and listen to it and stuff. You're also the president of Amerisearch Incorporated, and that's a publishing company dedicated to literally researching America's noble heritage.
Yeah. So I've written about 20 books, and I do a daily TV show called Faith and History, and then a radio spot. But I'm always honored, and Eddie and Tony, it's great to be on your show, and I just consider it a real honor.
Well, thank you so much. And just before you go, I know you do a lot. You've written some books on the founding fathers, and my 7th great grandfather was actually Richard Stockton. one of the signers.
Really?
Yeah, he was
Wow.
he was my seventh great grandfather. When I was doing research, I was like floored when I found out. So, yeah,
Yeah, he was imprisoned by the British
yeah.
and then tortured, and
Yep.
then his son was the one who founded Stockton, California. Helped
Exactly,
take
Robert.
California
Commodore
and,
Stockton.
for Mexico and make it its own state. So that's great.
Yeah, so it is an honor to have you on the show, and I can't wait to have you back for some more discussion.
And one more thing too, Bill, we appreciate what you're doing because there are so many people with their heads in their iPhones and their iPads and on their computers, and there's so little talk about aspects of history. And you're keeping it alive and well. You got a lot of heart and soul and enthusiasm and passion about it. So thank you for doing what you're doing to keep that part of our heritage alive. We appreciate you for that.
Yes, we do.
Oh, well, hey, well, thank you, and
happy-
I look forward to being on in the future.
Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.
And have a great dinner with your son.
All right,
Same to you. Thank you.
take care.
Bye.
All right. Well, we're going to take just a little break. But like you said, if you missed this, you and want to learn about Santa Claus and the history of Santa Claus, I never in my life would have guessed all of that.
You're going to learn more about Santa Claus right now from Bill than you have learned in your whole life,
Right.
unless you're a Santa-preneur or connoisseur.
I'm like, what the hell is that?
That would be a Saint Nick entrepreneur, but no, a connoisseur. Okay, what just happened?
I
He
hit the
fell
wrong-
from the sky.
It's the wrong button. So, we're going to take just a little break. When we come back, we're going to do an Unlock the Universe, and then you're going to stick around for the Shar Vision. But first, we're going to hear a little bit about Eddie's tour he's going to be taking in May of 2016. So, don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back. This is Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
Don't go anywhere.